You have a romantic relationship with every leading man you've ever starred with.
I make jokes about it, but I call it the cinema gods, and they mess with us. And the first thing that happens, usually, is the love scene.
Before you get to know each other?
You have a romantic relationship with every leading man you've ever starred with. I make jokes about it, but I call the cinema gods. And they mess with us. And the first thing that happens usually is the love scene before you get to know each other. She was called the next Grace Kelly before she was old enough to understand fame. By 14, Diane Lane was already a Hollywood obsession, appearing on major magazine covers while the world predicted a flawless future. We didn't really get along as well as we should have because he didn't speak English and it was tough. It was tough. What happened was he decided he liked me after the first kiss. He started to be friendly with me and I thought, is this really real? But away from the cameras, something far darker was unfolding. At 60, Lane is no longer protecting the image that made her famous. And the story she is finally ready to tell changes everything people thought they knew about her. Inside the chaos of Diane Lane's life. In December 2004, police sirens wailed outside a Los Angeles home. Inside, one of Hollywood's most elegant actresses had just made a desperate phone call to 911. Her husband, Josh Brolin, was arrested that night on charges of spousal battery. The headlines exploded across every tabloid in America. But this was not some troubled starlet with a history of drama. This was Diane Lane. He then posted $20,000 in bail and walked free. But the damage was done. There were endless speculation about what really happened behind closed doors. How did the most graceful actress in Hollywood end up in this nightmare? The woman who had just earned an Oscar nomination. The woman who had dated rock stars and movie icons. The woman every man in America seemed to desire. To find the answer, you need to know about the men who came before Josh Brolin. Because Diane Lane's romantic history reads like a who's who of Hollywood royalty and rock and roll legends. The truth is that Diane Lane's life had been filled with chaos, heartbreak, and scandal long before that terrible December night. To understand how she ended up here, we need to go back to the very beginning. But first, let us talk about the men. Diane Lane has been romantically linked to some of the most famous names in entertainment: John Bon Jovi, Matt Dillon, Timothy Hutton, Christopher Lambert, and of course, Josh Brolin. Some of these relationships she has confirmed herself. Others remain shrouded in mystery and speculation. In 2017, Diane finally addressed the rumors about her and rock legend John Bon Jovi. During a television appearance, she admitted they had dated for 5 months when she was 20 years old. She smiled when she talked about it, clearly holding fond memories. She said she thinks every girl should have such a wonderful experience at that age. For years, fans had speculated that his massive hit, "You Give Love a Bad Name," was written about her. Diane laughed this off, pointing out that she never even wore red nail polish. Before Bon Jovi, there was Timothy Hutton. The talented young actor had just won an Oscar for Ordinary People when he and Diane began dating. She was photographed in his arm at the 1981 Academy Awards as he celebrated his victory. They were young, beautiful, and seemingly perfect together. But like so many Hollywood romances, it did not last. Then there was Matt Dillon. Diane worked with him on 3 different films, and their chemistry was undeniable, both on screen and off. Rob Lowe later revealed that every young male actor on The Outsiders had a crush on Diane. But according to him, she would not give any of them the time of day. Except it seems for Dillon, their brief romance became the stuff of Hollywood legend. These were the romances that made headlines, but they were nothing compared to what was coming. The real drama of Diane Lane's love life began with 2 marriages that would bring her both incredible joy and devastating pain. 2 men who promised her forever. 2 relationships that ended in heartbreak and scandal. But to understand why Diane Lane kept choosing the wrong men, why she kept searching for a love that seemed to slip through her fingers, we need to understand where she came from. Because Diane Lane's childhood was anything but normal. In fact, it was the kind of childhood that would have destroyed most people. She was born to a Playboy centerfold and an acting coach who could barely pay rent. Her parents' marriage lasted only 13 days after her birth. And before she was even a teenager, her own mother would dose something so shocking that it sounds like a kidnapping thriller. Except every word of it is true. The runaway who raised herself. Diane Lane was born on January 22 ND, 1965 in New York City. Her entrance into this world was as dramatic as her life would become. Her mother, Colleen Farrington, was a stunning woman who had posed as Playboy's Miss October in 1957. She was also a nightclub singer and fashion model whose beauty captivated everyone who met her. Her father, Burton Eugene Lane, was an acting coach who drove a taxi on the side just to pay the bills. It seemed like the perfect combination for creating a star. Beauty from her mother, artistic passion from her father. But the fairy tale ended before it ever truly began. Her parents separated when Diane was just 13 days old. 13 days. Her mother fled to Mexico for a quick divorce while her father was left holding a newborn baby and wondering what had gone wrong. Diane later reflected on this painful reality. She described how tricky it was to live between two strong, passionate, and fiery parents who were never united in any way. They had always planned on sharing her, raising her together despite being apart. But Diane never once saw them as a couple. She never experienced what it felt like to have two parents in the same room who actually loved each other. Her father won custody when she was 6 years old, but stability remained a foreign concept. Burton Lane loved his daughter deeply, but he struggled financially. They lived in residential hotels, moving constantly around Manhattan. There was no family home with a backyard, no bedroom that stayed the same from year to year, just a series of temporary rooms and the constant uncertainty of where they would end up next. Her mother, meanwhile, had drifted away to pursue her own life. She would appear occasionally, a glamorous ghost who floated in and out of Diane's world. The little girl found herself torn between two completely different realities. Her father's world was loving but chaotic and poor. Her mother's world was distant but exciting and mysterious. Then came 1981. Diane was 16 years old and already famous. She had graced the cover of Time magazine. She had worked with legendary actors. Her future seemed limitless. That is when her mother reappeared. Colleen Farrington had been absent for years. But one day, she showed up and convinced Diane to get into her car. What Diane did not realize was that there was a man waiting inside and the door handles had been removed. Diane described this terrifying moment years later. She said all her mother wanted was to talk. But Diane was too busy freaking out because her mother was driving her to Georgia against her will. She could not escape. She could not call for help. She was trapped. Her mother drove her all the way to Augusta, Georgia. For 6 agonizing weeks, Diane was stuck there, separated from her father, her career, her entire life. Her father fought through the courts and eventually won her back. But the trauma left deep scars. Diane did not speak to her mother for 3 years. This was hardly the first time Diane had been forced to grow up too fast. Theater that required her to tour internationally for 6 years, often completely alone. Imagine being 7 years old and flying by yourself to European theater festivals. No mother at the airport, no father backstage, just postcards and phone calls to remind you that your parents existed somewhere far away. Diane later admitted that when she became a mother herself, she could never imagine doing that to her own child. She said her unconventional childhood definitely earned her a seat in therapy. By 15, Diane was done. She declared independence from her father and ran away to Los Angeles with young actor Christopher Atkins. She later called it reckless behavior from having too much independence too young. She said they were just puppies who did not know better. She eventually returned to New York, but not to her father's home. She moved in with a friend's family and paid rent with her acting money. At 15, Diane Lane was raising herself, paying her own bills, making her own decisions, living as an adult while legally still a child. This fierce independence would define her forever. She learned she could not rely on anyone. She learned love was unpredictable. She learned people leave without warning. But she also developed a deep craving for something she had never experienced. Stable love, real connection, a relationship where she would not be abandoned. That craving would shape every romantic decision she ever made. It would lead her to rock stars and movie icons. It would lead her to 2 marriages that promised forever. And it would eventually lead her to that devastating night when she had to call the police on the man she loved. The teenage star who captivated Hollywood. While other teenagers worried about homework and prom dates, Diane Lane was already working with legends. At 12 years old, she appeared in The Cherry Orchard at Lincoln Center alongside Meyer Street and Raul Julia. She was a child surrounded by theatrical giants, soaking in everything she could about the craft. Her big break came in 1979 with the film A Little Romance. Her co-star was Sir Laurence Olivier, widely considered one of the greatest actors who ever lived. Diane was only 14. Olivier was so impressed by this young girl that he called her the new Grace Kelly. From a legend of his stature, this was not casual praise. This was a prophecy. Diane later marveled at how a 72-year-old legend would take time to rehearse with 2 teenagers. His willingness to treat her as a real actress left a permanent mark on her soul. The film was a hit. Suddenly, Diane Lane was everywhere. Time magazine put her on the cover at 14 years old. Directors lined up to work with her. Critics declared she would become the biggest star of her generation. Then came Francis Ford Coppola. The legendary Godfather director cast Diane in 2 films in 1983. First was The Outsiders, a movie that became a cultural phenomenon. Diane was the only young woman in a cast packed with future superstars. Tom Cruise, Patrick Swayze, Matt Dillon, Rob Lowe, Elio Estes, Ralph Macchio, Thomas Howell. She played Cherry Valance, the beautiful girl too good for the greasers, but too curious to stay away. It was perfect casting. Innocence mixed with danger and desire. Being the sole woman on that set was unforgettable. She laughed about how it was too much testosterone for one girl. She kept to herself while the young men bonded and competed. They pranked her constantly, honey on her toilet seat, Vaseline on every door handle. She called it trauma bonding. Rob Lowe later admitted that every young male actor on The Outsiders had a crush on Diane. But according to him, she would not give any of them the time of day. That same year, Coppola cast her in Rumblefish. This was darker and more experimental than The Outsiders. Drummer Stuart Copeland played live on set to help actors feel time passing. Diane loved it. She came from experimental theater and felt comfortable with unconventional filmmaking. Then disaster struck. Streets of Fire in 1984 was supposed to make her an even bigger star. It flopped. The Cotton Club that same year also underperformed. Diane even received a RZZY nomination for Worst Actress. The painful truth is what she turned down. She was offered Splash, which launched Daryl Hannah. She was offered Risky Business, which made Tom Cruise a superstar. She rejected both to make Streets of Fire. By 20, Diane was exhausted and lost. She questioned whether acting was even what she wanted. She retreated to Georgia to reconcile with her mother. The same woman who had taken her against her will. They had homework to do, as Diane put it. Damagito repair. Hollywood had chewed her up and spit her out before she could legally drink. The next Grace Kelly was suddenly yesterday's news, but Diane Lane was far from finished. Her greatest roles were still years away, and so were the passionate romances that would define her personal life and nearly destroy her. The comeback in the role that changed everything. The late 1980s and early 1990s were wilderness years for Diane Lane. Hollywood had moved on to newer faces and younger stars. The girl once called the next Grace Kelly was now considered yesterday's news, but Diane refused to vanish. She found refuge in television. The 1989 miniseries Lonesome Dove earned her an Emmy nomination and reminded audiences she was still a remarkable actress. Critics called it a comeback, though Diane knew she had never truly left. She also battled agents who pushed her toward projects she did not believe in. When they pressured her to take Judge Dredd alongside Sylvester Stallone in 1995, she fought back. She told them to look at Stallone's last 8 movies and tell her what those films did for any woman who appeared in them. The answer was nothing. She fired those agents. The true resurrection came with A Walk on the Moon in 1999. She played a frustrated 1960s housewife who has a passionate affair during Woodstock summer. Her co-star was Viggo Mortensen, and Diane believed in him so fiercely that she sacrificed part of her own salary to ensure the studio could afford him. The film was sensual, emotional, and powerful. Diane portrayed a woman torn between duty and desire, between the safe life she had built and the wild freedom she craved. Critics noticed. Audiences fell in love with her again. Then came The Perfect Storm in 2000, which grossed over $328 million worldwide. Diane Lane finally became the household name she always should have been, but the defining role was still ahead. In 2002, director Adrian Lyne cast her in Unfaithful. The film followed a happily married woman who falls into an intense affair with a younger man. It demanded Diane portray desire, guilt, ecstasy, and devastation, sometimes in the same scene. Lyne had seen A Walk on the Moon and knew immediately she was perfect. He said she breathes a certain sexuality but remains sympathetic. That combination is rare and precious. The production was grueling. Diane later revealed she herniated her neck during intimate scenes with co-star Olivier Martinez. He was giving his all, she explained, which meant giving her all his body weight. One scene required her to just lie on the bed because that was all her body could handle. The most famous moment is a train scene where Diane's character relished the affair in her mind. Her face cycles through guilt, excitement, shame, and euphoria in seconds. Critics called it one of the most remarkable pieces of acting in years. One reviewer wrote that for an actress to be so direct takes more than talent. It requires courage. The performance earned Diane her first Academy Award nomination for Best Actress. The nomination arrived at a bittersweet moment. Those supposed to protect you might hurt you most. Yet despite these wounds, or perhaps because of them, she threw herself into romance with fierce intensity. We already know about her flings with Timothy Hutton, Matt Dillon, and Jon Bon Jovi, but those were just appetizers before the main course of heartbreak. The most significant romance of Diane's early life began in Paris in 1984. She was promoting the Cotton Club when she met Christopher Lambert. The French actor had just become famous for Greystoke, The Legend of Tarzan. Diane later said their connection was not quite love and not quite lust, but definitely something powerful. They reconnected 2 years later while filming in Rome. This time, the spark became a flame. They married in Santa Fe in October 1988. For a while, it seemed Diane had finally found the stable love she had searched for her entire life. Their daughter, Eleanor Jasmine Lambert, was born September 5, 1993. Diane was finally a mother. She had a family, a home. Everything she had craved since childhood seemed within reach. But Hollywood marriages are brutal, and this one proved no exception. Lambert's career demanded constant travel. He was gone for months at a time, leaving Diane alone with their daughter. She later admitted she was mostly celibate during her marriage because he simply was never there. She described herself as a nun in heat, waiting for him to return and make her feel wanted. In 1994, Diane filed for divorce. 6 years of marriage ended. Looking back, she called herself a rock bleeder. She said she had found the absolutely least likely person on the planet to give her what she needed. A painful confession from a woman who spent her whole life searching for security. The divorce devastated her. She became more guarded about who she let into her heart. She focused on Eleanor and her career. She was determined not to repeat the same mistakes. Years passed. Diane poured herself into work. She rebuilt her career with Lonesome Dove and A Walk on the Moon. She earned her Oscar nomination for Unfaithful. She proved to Hollywood and herself that she was more than a pretty face from the 80s. And then love found her again. It happened at a party in 2002. A man walked up to her and said 4 simple words that would change everything. Those words led to a passionate romance, a fairy tale wedding, and eventually the most scandalous night of her life. The night she called the police on the man who was supposed to love her forever. The marriage that made headlines. Diane Lane first crossed paths with Josh Brolin years earlier when he made a film with her. Then husband Christopher Lambert. They were acquaintances at best, two actors in the same circles who never truly connected. That changed at an after-party for A Beautiful Mind in 2002. Josh walked up to her with a confident smile and said 4 words. Hi, remember me? She did. And this time everything was different. Josh Brolin was rugged, intense, magnetic. He came from Hollywood royalty as the son of actor James Brolin, but he had forged his own difficult path. He had struggled for years in his famous father's shadow before finally breaking through. He had a reputation for being passionate and unpredictable. A man who lived life at full volume. A man who said exactly what he thought and did exactly what he wanted. Diane was drawn to that energy. After years of feeling alone in her first marriage, after years of being guarded and careful, she finally let herself fall. She let herself believe that this time would be different. This time the love would last. They dated for 2 years. Friends noticed how happy Diane seemed. She laughed more. She opened up more. It appeared that she had finally found what she had been searching for her entire life. Then on August 15, 2004, they married at Brolin's California ranch. About 70 guests witnessed the ceremony. The bride was radiant. The groom was beaming. It seemed like a fairy tale ending for two people who had both experienced failed marriages and career disappointments. Two survivors who had finally found each other. The fairy tale lasted exactly 4 months. In December 2004, Diane Lane picked up the phone and called 911. She told police that Josh had hit her. Officers arrived and arrested Brolin on misdemeanor spousal battery charges. He posted $20,000 bail and was released. The headlines exploded across America. Josh Brolin arrested for